And I think sometimes we expect more straightforward representation from people in the past than we expect during our own time. Like, I think we accept this kind of vagueness of reference in our symbols sometimes and don't realize that people 2000 years ago could be as vague.
Oh, yeah.
Driving around, I see a bumper sticker or, a little series of bumper stickers that has, the dad and the mom and the three little kids and the dog. It's like, okay, each sticker represents a particular person who exists. Okay, that's a direct representation. But when you see the bumper sticker that has the Tyrannosaurus eating the stick family members, I doubt that those stick family members represent specific people. They represent more the concept of somebody else's stick figure family, but not a particular one. Right. And I wonder if sometimes in these Bracteates this is exactly that vague. Like it's just supposed to be kind of the grandeur of a king, a grand personage, without necessarily being like, oh, this is so and so, son of so and so.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got copies of copies of copies of copies.
Precisely.
I start this video by thanking my Patreon supporters who help make it possible for me to make a living teaching subjects of my expertise in the world's most beautiful places, and to everyone who buys my books. Thank you so much.
Let's welcome our guest for today, Dr. Krister Vasshus, who appeared once before on this channel earlier this year talking about the fascinating find from Norway. It's often been referred to lately as the Baird find. Today we're talking about the fantastic Bracteates found in Denmark, and the actual find date was in 2021, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Can you give us a little bit of background about this actual the find itself? What's in it, where it's from, what dates we're talking about?
Yeah. The find itself was made by a metal detectorist who had gotten, it was the first or second time he was using his metal detector on his friend's field. And he found something and called his friend, saying, well, what is this? And they agreed it looks like gold, but they couldn't really determine whether it was real gold or some, sometimes you can have chocolates in shapes of golden, big golden coins. So they thought it might be the silver wrappings of that type of candy. But they found stuff, loads of it, and it weighed a lot, and it in the end didn't really look like candy wrappings. So they figured out fairly quickly that it's something. Called the museum, who couldn't come straight away, so they put it in a shoes box, almost 1 kilo of gold. And what they are mainly Bracteates, meaning thin gold foil, which has been used as medallions. The exact dating is it's an approximate dating of somewhere between the end of the 300s up until sometime in the 500s, maybe up until 600 approximately. But the very typically we say it's around four or 500s. A very typical Germanic thing. They are clearly influenced by Roman golden, the solidi, the golden coins of Rome, with the impressions of emperors, and we can see that in the motifs we often see in the Germanic Bracteates are sometimes attempted copies of the Roman solidi, but as time goes on, they start to get this Germanic expression in the coins or in the medallions, because they will be used as medallions. They have this, what's it called? The piece where you put the necklace thing. What's it? What's it
What
called?
would I call that? Is that the loop?
Yeah, the loop. That's probably it. Yeah. So they have this loophole showing that they have been used as medallions, and in some cases there are several. Not in this particular hoard, but in other finds, there are several bracteates with intercepted with sort of orbs, golden orbs, or there's a long line of several bracteates on one. And yes, they have likely been used as medallions primarily. And this particular find was close to 900 grams of gold, mostly in form of bracteates, and some of them are incredibly big. So bracteate is usually the size of a what can I internationally compare it with? Well, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter, a couple of inches in diameter. But some of the ones from the Vindelev hoard are really, really big. The biggest one, the biggest bracteates of all, is one that has been intentionally folded. You can see that it's with intention because it's so accurate. And so we expect this to have been deposited. So intentionally put into a hoard and not just randomly lost.
How big is that one? This
I could. It's all in the article. I can't recall the numbers of the biggest one because that one doesn't have runes, so I haven't looked too much into that one. But 6 of these bracteates found in Vindelev have runes, and we have been looking at that fairly quickly. There were photographies of the bracteates put out by the museum in Vejle, which is the local museum close to Vindelev. That is in the southwestern part of Jutland, very close to Jelling, where the monumental rune stones of Harald the Bluetooth, more or less proclaims the kingship and the Christianing process of Denmark. But that's, of course, several centuries later than this deposit of gold in Vindelev. So that was the starting point. When a find like that is made, it's sort of a national treasure. So it's not just the local museums that get the responsibility for dealing with it. It's also the National Museum in Copenhagen. So the runologist at the National Museum, Lisbeth Emer, was contacted, and she contacted me so that she wouldn't be alone on the whole thing, because there was a lot of runes, and the language form is some sort of Proto-Norse or Proto-Nordic, or whatever you want to call this language stage. It's always a discussion I have with myself when I speak about it in English. The Scandinavian term for it is Ur-Nordisk, which works well in Scandinavian, but it's not really a proto-language, because when you add proto to the language, it means in effect that it's a reconstructed language, and Proto-Norse is partly reconstructed, but we do have these runic inscriptions, which are literary sources. So.
Right. I struggle with this a little bit, but I have slightly reluctantly tended to use Proto-Norse just because it is apparently the most used term for the language. And I feel like using something else, I have to take extra time to explain what I mean.
Yeah.
So,
I follow you on that one. So let's, for the purpose of this conversation, let's call it Proto-Norse.
Works for me.
Yep.
And a lot of attention has focused on this one particular bracteate
Yes.
that contains, as far as I think anybody else has said, still the oldest written attestation of a Norse god's name. Is that right?
The first written attestation of the name of Odin, that's for certain. But you can always argue whether some of the scribes of Rome and Greece might have, like, such as Nerthus in
I guess so.
Germania.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay,
But,
so at least the oldest attestation of the name Odin.
Yes. Yeah. And
So
certainly by the cultures that worship themselves as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which is a significant qualification.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about this bracteate? And you are co-host if you want to show any images or text or anything.
Yeah, that I should have thought of that. I have some really nice images, which I can find. But yes, we took a look at these bracteates, all of them in a microscope, and the one we were the most interested in was one that's already on the photography that was published online by the local museum. We could see that some of the runes seems to have the name of Odin. Well, that's in its Proto-Norse form, Wodan in its genitive form, Wodnas. But there's one rune missing, and the other runes were very unclear, so we really needed to have a look at it in the microscope to be certain. And we did look at it, and we did manage to transcribe most of the runes. There are some runes that are very difficult to read, and a couple that we can't really be certain of, which makes the entire inscription difficult to read, but it certainly ends with something that would have been pronounced something like is Wodnas Werar, meaning, and then I would have to have a discussion of the pronoun is, because is in the Proto-Germanic language is the word for he. He, yes, the first personal pronoun. No, third personal pronoun. But when we get to the Old Norse language, this word has developed into something that means who, that, which. So it sort of introduces a subordinary clause, a relative pronoun, you could call it, referring to a person who's already been mentioned. And it's quite likely, I think, that in this particular inscription, it means the same thing as it does in the Old Norse language. I would have expected the Proto-Norse of approximately year 400, or at least somewhere in the 400s, to have established the third personal pronoun that all the Scandinavian languages, North Germanic languages have today, which is han, as the go-to pronoun for the third personal pronoun. Yeah, so this is getting very technical. Basically what it means is that,
but this is an audience that appreciates these technical questions, so don't worry about that.
Yeah. What it means is that it doesn't necessarily say he is Odin's man. It quite possibly more likely says something, 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 who is Odin's man.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because when I first saw anything about this months ago, I was really struck by that pronoun. But you have to assume one way or another that there is some word missing.
Yeah.
Right. Probably a verb is. No matter if you're taking it as he or as who. So, but then the rest of the text was so difficult to read from anything that I could see months ago, that I couldn't figure out what the context of it was exactly. But your paper does propose a reading for most of it, although, as you pointed out, there are some very difficult to read parts.
Yeah, in fact, so difficult that we propose 6 different solutions to what it says, and one of those is we don't really know. It can say something about, yeah, an eye person who says something about maybe hunting and catching, and who is Odin's man. Yeah. But yes, it's a very interesting piece of text, and our interpretation of some of the runes are conjectures, meaning that they are uncertain. They don't look exactly like the runes. An example, the rune that we think might be a P, it does not look exactly like a P rune. It's also a bind rune, which means that it is simultaneously also a T rune. And this particular rune, yeah, it looks odd, and it may be a part of a verb in the first person, meaning then I help. So the verb form would be helpu in Proto-Norse, which is what we think it says, if we accept that the P rune, well, the rune that might not be a P rune is a P rune. It says, or might say, helpu.
Do you have an image of the P so we can see what you're talking about?
Yeah, let me see if I can find our.
That's interesting though, because of course one thing that occurs to me in talking about P is what a relatively rare sound it is in early Germanic languages.
Yeah.
So that it would probably be a somewhat less used rune. And
Precisely.
actually, on one of the Elder Futhark Abacaderia, I can't remember if it might be on the Shilber stone, the P looks like a B, right? There's like the P and the B look almost the same, just one has a longer stave or something like that. So it seems like there's a lot of variation or uncertainty about P early on.
That would make sense because, as you say, it's one of those sounds that we don't, well, it exists, of course, in language, but let me see if I can share this. Can you see?
Yes.
Yes. So let me see. We think that the entire inscription starts with this H in front of his face.
Okay.
So as you can see, we can't really see the runes that are here. And then it's Ho, E, and this particular rune is what I'm talking about with the hatches here, which are supposed to have 2 extra bistaves to make a proper P, in addition to the extra bistaff here. Yeah, so helpu, and the interesting part here is that we also have 2 identical runes next to each other, which is also uncommon in inscriptions of the Elder Futhark. In general, actually, in runic inscriptions. But what one of our suggestions, at least, is that it says hostias or hostior, helpu, ufar, patai, yagai, id, wodanas, and we think it says verar here. W rune and the bind rune, which is E rune here, and the traces of the R rune on the side here. Traces of an A rune and the rune that everyone disagrees about the sound value of, but something like a Z sound, something between a Z and a R. But at this early stage, it's I think fairly unproblematic to just say it's a Z, normal Z, because in the runic corpus we only see the confusion between this rune and the R rune much later on in the Viking Age.
I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot here. Starting with the very first word of the inscription, you were suggesting this could be a borrowing from Latin. Yes,
we are going wild with this one, because the Latin word hostia, it's a feminine word meaning sacrifice. It's a word that's used in the pagan religion of the Romans. Later on, it's adopted by the Christian religion, and a particular part of the communion is referred to as the hostia in the Catholicism. So even in Christianity, it's also a part of the sacrifice during the communion. And the reasoning for us saying that this is a loan word from Latin, well, there are a lot of reasons for we could have had loan words from Latin at this point. We already have the Falvard stool, which says scamella. It means stool or little chair, and it's a loan word from Latin, written in runes, and also with an addition of alguscadi, possibly meaning the hunter of the elk, or certainly someone who hurts the elk.
The moose herder.
Yeah.
Armor.
So we know that there are loans from Latin. One could always argue, why would there be loan words in the religion? Well, we're dealing with a certain type of finds that are very closely related to the Roman Empire. You get the gold from the Roman Empire. We can't produce anything from gold in Scandinavia without the Romans at this point. The imagery on the bracteates are clearly influenced by Roman imagery. This particular bracteate, you can see very close resemblance to the emperors. Their head gear is very typical for Roman emperors, or depiction of Roman emperors at this time. And even the head in a profile is very typical for Roman imagery on the solidi, the coins. But of course, what is particularly Germanic in this particular one is the horse. The look of it all is very Germanic in a way. There's this cultural symbol that I'm going to say that we don't really know what means. I know a lot of people will have opinions about this. Some people do indeed think it represents Odin, but it's a different discussion, I think. I'm not going to open that can at the moment. But yes, just to say that certainly this isn't a type of object that has a lot of Roman influence in it. And of course, we know that people have been fluent in Latin at this point. There are some issues with it. We don't really have a trace of a word like this in the later stages of North Germanic languages. So all the known vocabulary connected to religion and cult and rituals in Old Norse are words from Germanic, or, well, possibly very closely related to Celtic in any case. Certainly no loan words as such from Latin. That's something that comes later on with Catholicism. So you have arguments to and fro, which is also why we do have an extra suggestion of saying that we don't really know what this word is. It may mean sacrifices in the plural, we think, because of the gap between here. It's so long that it would be a O rune, which combined with the Z rune means that it's a plural of a feminine O stem word.
I think it's a really bold suggestion. And of course, at the time, you might expect a certain amount of, well, you point out some cultural fluency in Roman terms, and also potentially language fluency in Latin, even though those words didn't continue to be used. I'll tell you an idle thought that crossed my mind looking at it is, when you first pulled this picture up, I read it as hostly, right, without the second bar.
Yeah.
But I thought about just idly on the Rookstone, isn't there a word like that that's plausibly connected to Gothic Hunsel, right? Like a sacrifice, something like that.
Yeah.
Just an idle thought.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with the sounds of the Proto-Norse language to connect it to the same vocabulary as you see on the Rökstone.
But if it is a Latin feminine, then it's also being borrowed as a feminine here.
Yes.
Which shows, again, potentially, fluency on the part of the borrowing party.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think that it's a bold and very interesting solution.
It is. I agree. It is bold, and I'm not entirely convinced myself. Thus, me having more suggestions. One reasonable, I think, different suggestion would be to say that the name or the title of the person who is the Ek in this inscription, because we don't, certainly in the runes we see here, there's no Ek. And it makes sense that there would be an Ek. If this means helpu, the word that we see here, it sort of requires an Ek, because it's the first person. Is you in this language stage, as in Old Norse, you would what's the word?
It's not pro-drop, is it? So you would expect the subject pronoun is what you mean.
Yeah, the subject would concur with the grammatic form of the verb, and so on. The grammar would sort of fit.
And it's hard to see what else to do with that next sequence. I mean, your reading of Helpu seems like the only thing you could.
That's that's the only thing that makes sense from what we can see. But the next word, ufar, as well, is also completely unattested in the later stages of Old Norse. The only thing I could possibly compare it to would be the Gothic word for over, but it doesn't really make sense to put a Gothic word in an inscription that seems to be clearly Proto-Norse, in the sense that it has an example, whereas it has the Z rune, which Gothic wouldn't use. so this particular word ufar, we have suggested an etymology for it, which is very dubious. It is, yeah. You mentioned the word bold. I think linguistically you could also say that interpreting ufar as a word meaning over, a stationary adverb, it would be then similar to words like where. It's the same ending, war. Yeah, I forget the other. There are a couple of other parallels as well, but they're formed slightly differently, and all the other ones are formed in the same way, whereas this ufar then would be formed in a slight different way. So it linguistically would not be the same, although it would make sense in the interpretation of saying the help is above the situation of what then follows the rest of the text. So yeah, the help is above, and then we have this next really interesting part. There's a bind rune of A and T here. Fatai, which seems to have the I as a dative, because help requires a dative. As a verb, it takes the dative. So fatai would then be, normally we would have just an E rune. So fate would be the expected Proto-Norse form. It's only in Proto-Germanic you would actually have the sound value of I representing dative. So that's interesting. It could just be an archaic spelling. The knowledge of, you know, the ancient forms. We see it in possibly a couple of other inscriptions. So yes, this might be a dative, fatai, and then it would mean something that, yeah, like the catcher. Or fata, it means to grip or hold fast, to catch. And then either just yaga, the J rune, the A rune, and a bind rune combining the G and the A. But it's also possible that this I rune could be in connection with this, the rest of this word, because as with let's see, the Scamella Alguskadi, there's also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, an example of a rune representing being represented with one rune, but really also the sound of the end of the last word and the start of the first word. Does that make sense? Yeah. Opposed to what we already see here, which may contradict this. Well, it would certainly mean that the writer of these runes did not follow his or her use of this already. But if this yaga or yagai is a personal name, meaning etymologically possibly connected to hunt, the word zu jagen in German is to hunt. We've borrowed it from German in modern Scandinavian. So jage has the J sound, which otherwise would have disappeared from this word if we kept it in the Scandinavian languages. So whether it's a personal name or just something meaning the hunter, it's difficult to say. But all in all, it could mean something like the entire inscription would then mean sacrifices, exclamation mark. help is above the situation of the catcher Yaga or the catcher hunter. It's difficult to say really who is Odin's man. It's one possible interpretation that we gave. And there are several details to fix on here, whether we see the Yaga as connected to the catcher, or it's just a personal name separate. How many full stops are intended in these the whole sequence in all. So many questions. But the interesting thing is that after having decided that these must be the runes, we took a look at one of the other bractates in the horde. Let's see. And after having looked at it, I thought that I could see the same words in some places. In this particular one, it's mirrored compared to the one we just looked at, but the inscription starts at the same place. It looks different. In example, the S is lying down. And we have something that looks like an L rune between the I and the Z, which could possibly be just an A rune that have been poorly executed or worn or something like this. But all in all, it seems like this is an attempted copy of what you just saw.
Yeah, Hostias, then it looks like Hetu, though.
Exactly, it looks like Hetu because the one that we had with the extra, that I suggested as a P, it doesn't have the extra side rune, side staff here. So it looks like Hetu, which is at this point not really a word. It would be tempting to say that it's a version of to be called Haita or Heta, but it doesn't make sense in this grammatical form, Hetu.
It's also early for that monophthongization to have happened.
Yes. We would have to explain it with something crazy, like it's a reduplication that has been reshaped significantly, and other difficult jumps over the fences without really explaining where and how and why. But all in all, it seems to be some sort of copy of not exactly the same. It doesn't have to be the same bractates that we just saw. It could be, or it certainly just have the same origin. Which we found really interesting, and we think it sort of opens the door of how to analyze bractates from now on. Because when we look at the inscriptions of bractates, I took a look at it in connection with this, and a lot of them seem to have really odd interpretations compared to what it actually says. I mean, what the actual runes on them are. And it seems to me that many of the ones that we have established interpretations of really needs a revision. Not all of them. Some of them are interesting enough, but sometimes we have the same sort of mishmash of, I mean, how do we read these sequences? Right. It's close to impossible. And we certainly can't find the words that they're supposed to represent. And the likelihood for that is that it's been copied and recopied, and possibly through different types of material. So you would get a possibly carved on wood for the goldsmith to look at. And we have to remember that the runes that you look at now, when you hold them in your hand, they are about 2 millimeters tall. So with my eyesight using these, fair enough. I need the microscope, but during the Iron Age, these are people who are not a day above 40, I can tell you. And I think you need training even from you're really young to be able to make all these golden details. I think they were young, the goldsmiths.
That's a good point. And you know, I wonder, looking at like the previous Bractier, is that a first or second hand copy? And then is this one a fifth or sixth hand copy? But they're both copies of something.
Yeah.
That, you know, maybe the very first one made a little bit more sense, because even the previous Bractier, like it's not straightforward.
Precisely. I've come to the same conclusion here as time has gone, that the confusion of the P and the L bind rune and the strange stationary adverb ufar, it's probably not right, I think.
Yeah.
So they were made by someone who was very skilled at making runes. I mean, they are. Let's have a look at them again. Look at the staffs here. They are pointy in the ends. They are really, really beautiful. So the person who made this must really be aware of runic knowledge, which makes it interesting then that he made this, which we're not sure about what does it mean, and that there are two runes of the same quality next to each other. Interestingly, the F runes just look like upside down A runes. That might be just because of space. I mean, again, 2 millimeters is not a lot. But the skill behind this is incredible. But the question is, of course, did the writer know what was intended with what it says? I mean, was he or she the person who heard the order of it's supposed to say this, or made the words themselves, or were they presented with a piece of wood or a piece of clay with the order of make this? I'm more and more towards the solution of this being a copy of a copy, maybe.
But not quite as far as the other one, which is like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy.
Yeah.
Because this one is so, you're right. I mean, when you point out, it is just so well done.
Yeah.
And I mean, even the F, which you like, I actually kind of read that as being like it's almost like a right left facing F, right? That's just sort of like that. It's just reversed in that respect. It's sort of how I read it. But you know, then you also have the Helpu, which is kind of right left reversed. I don't know. It's
that's true. It would make it would maybe make more sense to say that it says Heplu if you were to read it. It's flipped in a way.
Yeah, which makes me wonder exactly how it's being put in there. Actually, there've been some questions in the chat about that. Both Kathy and Blake were wondering what technique was used. You know, were they stamped? Were they poured from molds? Lost wax? What kind of?
They are made with so it's sort of made mirrored to what you see here. meaning that the inscription would have been made from left to right by the person who made it. So imagine this just mirrored. So they made something in, which material was it again? I can't remember now. But they made it in a different material and then used a thin gold foil and stamped it on. So much like minting coins in a way. But there's no impression on the back side of this. So it's just this front side that has imagery. The back side is just flat. So yeah, it's not the, you don't get the other one in its negative in a way. In a way, you see what you see here is the negative of what was initially made.
I guess the point of these things is probably not to be read so much. It's just they're supposed to look good. But
that might be. I've been thinking a lot about literacy in Scandinavia at this point, because of course most of the things we find are, well, objects like gold and weapons and things that maybe occasionally things that have been deposited in the bogs that have been able to preserve, like handles of shields. So stuff that was made by the elite, used by the elite, rune stones raised for the elite of the society. And then we should probably expect most things to have been made, well, carved on was in wood. It makes perfect sense compared to, thinking of how they are always just straight lines and not bowed and bended. The writing with the or carving with straight lines, I find, is at least in some cases much more easy when you carve on wood. It's not always true, but most of the cases it's true. I know that because the job I have now is mostly carving runes as examples for guests in the new job I have. And when I do that, I can notice that in most of the cases, it's better, it's easier, it shows better. And I think it's safe to say that most things were carved on carved on wood, but wood just disappears easily. So we have just a few things from wood preserved, such as the Falbard stool and a couple of things from bogs. A tiny, what's it called, a wood plane, an example. A few other tools, different types of handles, lance shafts, so on. All stuff for the elite.
And speaking of this, what is the job where you're carving runes?
Yeah, I'm working in the Land of Legends, is the English name. In Danish, it's called Sagnlandet Lejre. It's a science-based activity center, science pedagogic activity center. Reconstructed houses from different historical and prehistoric times. I usually work in Iron Age village from approximately 2,000 years ago, dressed up in Iron Age clothes, and talk about the Iron Age, do things the Iron Age way, the smithy, tend to the animals, carve the runes. We have a sacrificial bog that I perform some sacrifices in, and so on. Oh. And then we have a Viking Age hall, also based on the biggest of the Viking halls that have been found in Gammel Leire, with the Skildungs, Beowulf, all of that took place just around the corner from here. So that's a part, the Viking and sort of transitional period, the period between, the Valhalla saga. What's that called in English? Do you know?
Mythical heroic sagas, romantic sagas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's my job now. In addition to, of course, writing articles on runes and other interesting things.
I can't decide if this sounds like a great job or a job that would drive me crazy, but that's a fun idea.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question from the chat? Blake was wondering, something else you talked about in your article was the difference between Houaz, Houaz, versus Horaz, a word that we see in these inscriptions.
That's the first thing that we address in the article. Let's see, because in this horde was also a very similar bractate to one of the bractates that has more or less kicked off the whole debate about the Odin's hate and the presence of Odin on bractates. And that sprung out from an interpretation of this word as Hovar, being an example of the Odin hate that we see in Hovarmol, so the tall one. I've never really adhered to that theory because it doesn't make linguistic sense. It's impossible if we follow the sound rules that we have in the Scandinavian language. It can't be that word. You would have to say then that this word represents a disappeared version of a Scandinavian language that we don't really have other traces of, which doesn't make sense at all. Well, of course it could happen, but when all the other inscriptions are somewhat readable into the premises of the Proto-Norse language, then it doesn't make sense to make up a new language for this particular inscription. In any case, and we were not the ones who discovered this. This has been a discussion for a long time, and a lot of scholars have adhered to the interpretation that it says horas, and one of the interpretations of that word is that it's connected to the Latin carus, that it's cognate to carus, which means the dear one. It is a word that we the Germanic words for whore, an example, as in prostitute, and also Scandinavian words for someone who not exactly uses whores, but fucks around, to be blunt. Yeah. That would also be really, you could say that this word could even mean that. It would make sense linguistically to say that this word means someone who fornicates. But that doesn't really fit the general impression that you get from bractates. So that's why people have preferred the word meaning deer. So more in connection with the more original etymological ancestor of the deerness, developed into something different in Germanic later on, or simultaneously, most likely. But yes, so that's but quite technically what it means, that the reason why I don't think it could possibly mean the tall one is that you have a diphthong O, the O and U combined, O, but you lack the H that is supposed to be between the diphthong here and the A rune here.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't make sense because this, in all the daughter languages, this diphthong have been monophthongized, and that means that instead of being o, or au, it becomes just a long r sound, later developing into o sound. And this monophthongization happens regularly in front of h. But in this case, the h has already disappeared, which happens later on if you follow the normal roots of the language, this h disappears. But if it disappears before the diphthong is monophthongized, it does not develop into the word hor, meaning tall. So yes, that's the very technical part of this.
But it's interesting that this is even a question and has persisted for so long. And I think part of that is if you just read handbooks or web articles about Elder Futhark runes, you get kind of an impression of, you know, a little bit more uniformity and clarity than there often is in these inscriptions. But the U and the R in Elder Futhark are so often so hard to tell apart.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't the only case of that, where sometimes it seems like in one inscription or another, the only difference is if it bends in a tiny bit or bends out a tiny bit.
Yeah. It's truly tricky, because let me tell you, people did not always take great care in making this very accurate. I mean, if you look at this rune, which seems to be an R because, you know, of this little dent, but it's not completely connected to the main staff. And that's something we see very often. We saw it in the oldest rune stone as of yet as well, in Idiberog. The R is very open. And as you say, there's several cases of this. So it's it's a known problem in runic inscriptions. Interestingly, we think this sequence might be identical to a sequence found on a runestone found in Norway in 2007, I think it was, the Hoganvik stone, which says Ek erafar, the eye of the wolverine, I naudigastir, the guest in need, or the guest of need, or something like that. It also has an additional sequence where it says double A R, something like Arba, and this may be, if we consider it not a D rune but a mirroring similar to the mirroring we have in the A runes here, could be a doubling of the P rune. But there's also a case of P runes looking like this. It's a German example. I can't recall the name of. See, I should probably just look because it's in the. No, it's going to be boring for me to look it up. It's in the article, but it's going to be boring for your guests to listen or to look at me trying to find something in my own article. But yes, that's an example of a P looking like an open D. So it might be the exact same word. And as we see here, something that looks like alu, it mostly look like ALL, but it's close enough to the alu formula to make it, well, it's realistic to assume that they intended it to mean alu. There is also the ladu, L-A thorn U. So this is bractate with at least 2 other formulaic words. So it's possible that the Hoganvik stone also contains a formulaic word identical to this one. Interesting detail.
Yeah, it really is. And that's Wolverine.
Yeah, the Wolverine, the Edifas, yeah.
Yeah, that's just, it's striking because it's not a animal you think about or see written about very much.
Nope.
Or mentioned much in later Norse literature that I can recall. Just like, yeah, I mean, like I can understand the appeal.
Yeah, you know. Absolutely. It's a very interesting little animal, sort of a bear-wolf hybrid. Makes you wonder if all the Björnulf might be just intentional wolverines.
Yeah, I never thought about that. I've only seen one once, and it is an impressive little creature.
Mm-hmm.
We've taken about an hour of your time. Are you okay to answer some more questions? Do you need to go?
Absolutely. I have plenty of time.
Okay. Let me look in the commentary and make sure that we haven't missed questions, because there's been some discussion in there. Just make sure. And of course, folks, throw in questions if you have them. Well, as we were talking about the 2 bracteates with somewhat similar looking inscriptions, Jay asked, so if we're likely looking at imperfect copies, does this make the conclusions about ease, you know, that form potentially less certain? I guess it would.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. So the pronoun, you mean?
Yeah, if I take the question to be, if this is an imperfect copy, does that make our concerns about like, well, what word is missing, or how do we interpret this? Does that make that you know, a little bit even more in the air?
Yes, it is. The answer is absolutely yes. The more something has been corrupted, the more likely it's different from its intention. And the more it gets copied, I don't know if you have the anecdote of one feather becoming 3 chickens or something like that. It's a story about a chicken that pulls out a feather, and the other chicken starts talking about one of the chickens pulled out a feather, and next one. It's like having the game of whispering as well, where you have a big circle and you whisper a word, and when it gets back to you, or if it's a sentence, in any case, it's even more corrupted when you get it back in the end. So the same principle, yeah.
One feather, 3 chickens. I had not heard it put that way, but that's a fun anecdote.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the now kind of famous one, I was just thinking, I mean, even as nice as that looks, even though that's probably only a first or second hand copy, it's still like, it's just not very clear, right? It's not a straightforward message, which you do sometimes get in Elder Futhark inscriptions.
Yeah, they are not the same type of formulaic messages that we find in many other types of Elder Futhark inscriptions.
Yeah, and the very syntactic complication of it is weird for such a short inscription. You know?
Yes.
Ronvag asked, do I remember correctly that there was a bracteate with a weird fish man on it?
Oh yes. Oh, it's so pretty and interesting. The weird fish man. It's really pretty and it's so interesting and fascinating. You can see it, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. The inscription here is completely corrupted. It's impossible to read, really. It does not really make anything. So it's a copy of a copy of a copy, either that or it's just supposed to look like runes.
Mm-hmm.
But as we can see something that looks very Germanic in its expression. But if you would Google Roman Emperor and Victoria statue, you would find some images of Roman depictions where the Roman emperor would be holding a statue of the goddess of victory, Victoria, and it looks almost exactly the same, just with the Roman expression. The goddess would have wings, and these wings have become a fishtail in this Germanic version of it. I'm not sure what this is supposed to mean, but this is certainly the laurel leaf. What's it called?
The wreath or
the bay leaf wreath they would have on their heads. Yeah. And there are so many interesting similarities between the two that it's impossible to view it as not influenced by it. But at the same time, this just looks so really, really interesting. I mean, to be in the minds or at least the context of the person who made this, if it means something, I mean, it could, of course, be expressions of something that went on in some way in the Scandinavian societies. I would just really, really like to have seen what on earth this could be.
Yeah.
But yes.
I would like to hear how the fishman was described, right? Who is like how are they talking about this in proto-norms? What is this? Yeah, it's just bizarre. And then there's also kind of another animal below the big head.
Yes, with a very long tongue.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of looks like a horse or a dog the way they draw them, but I assume
it's got a very long tail, thin tail. Could be a dog or I don't know if it could be a wolf. It with these types of feet, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
fascinating.
And then, as you point out, the runes. I mean, it looks to me kind of like when someone just wants to make marks on a sign that are supposed to look like Chinese letters and knows no Chinese. Right? It's like, I mean, like there's kind of a couple of those look like actual letters.
Yeah.
But not in any kind of sequence that makes words.
No. In fact, in the article I made an example of how if I were to conject, if I were to say an example that this is a U and this is an I, and there's another U and an I, and
That's
if generous. We sort of accept that this is a G rune and sort of accept that this is an A rune, it would say Wiwigas, and I could give this an interpretation of being a personal name and give etymology of that. And then this A rune, I could say that it's the preposition an, because you can leave out the N rune in the runic script sometimes. Could also be that it's already with the N loss during the syncope era, where the language was changed a lot and the nasals disappeared on the end of the words and so on. And then S rune, A rune, G rune, and a U. And then this would read Wiwigar, an sagu, meaning we regard in the saga.
But that's such a stretch.
Exactly. It's a complete stretch on so many levels and conjectures all over. So I use that as an example of, please, runologists, be careful with your translations. Be true to the signs that you actually see. And when you really can't tell, it may just be, well, it's interesting to give wild interpretations, but when it's unlikely to be true, in example here, we said that this may be an A rune, and it doesn't look enough like this. We also said that this is a G rune, which looks nothing like this. So why would the same carver execute the runes so differently? And
you're also stretching the time period so much. I mean,
precisely.
You've got to assume that certain sound changes are happening too early, that certain writing changes are happening too early. Like, why aren't they writing the "wa" sound with the "wa" rune? Why are they using the "u"? And it's a nice teaching moment.
Yeah.
Something in the chat, Blake was asking whether you could touch on sorry if I'm slightly misinterpreting the question, but just to get to what I think is at the core there, are we looking at Odin or a human king in that Bractate where we've got that reference to Wothnoz?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The proper answer should probably be maybe or maybe not. What we have said in this article is taking the example of, well, both because it talks about someone being Odin's man, in combination that we know that it's very much influenced by the Roman imagery of emperors, meaning the ruler of the society. And a quote from Saxo, the Danish scribe who writes the Danish history. He writes about King Froða, Frodo, who is one of those legendary Skjoldung kings who lived just around the corner from here. He, at some point, wants this really hot woman to marry him. But he can't go and ask himself. He wants someone else to go the bidding. And for this job, he offers a payment. And the description of this payment is, let me see if I can find it. It's a very... So the king recognized the value of the work, so he presents a golden necklace and offered it as a reward if he should go on his errand. This necklace was a chain of golden knobs in raised works intercepted with images of kings, which could be contracted and expanded by the help of an inner thread, an ornament of luxury rather than one of use. And this particular description is more or less what we can see here, isn't it? And Saxo refers to these images as images of kings. So we've taken that as an example that it's an orally, what's it called? Orally transmitted story, a memory of the past. King Froða was one of the he was a king during the must have been during the Iron Age, possibly during the time that bractates were in use. And because his descriptions sound so much like this particular find of bracteates. We think it's rather likely that this is what's being described here as well. So someone at some point has thought this as images of kings. But of course, at the same time, we know that the kings of the yore were kings with legitimacy given by the kings. The gods. I mean, even the Skildung dynasty was descended by Odin. The Inglings were descended by Yngvi Frey. So they are godly. The same goes for continental Germanic dynasties. The Merovingians, descending from some sort of sea monster or a river monster, but still. So they have this religious legitimacy, and quite possibly as the Roman emperor, who was also both emperor and god at the same time, may have had the same status as both being a demigod at least and a king, a human. So the answer is yes, maybe both, perhaps not, or maybe Odin, maybe a king, maybe both Odin and a king. And we know for a fact that people in the Scandinavian area really liked, stupid fly, go away, really liked being ambiguous. Well, not ambiguous, that's not the word. For stuff to have more than one meaning. And I mean, some of the bracteates where you see the hair turning into a bird and the feet becoming the mouth of wolves and so on, it's a part of the art for something to be more than one thing. And the personal names are also often thematic, being put two linguistic elements put together that sometimes can seem like they contradict each other, like Björnulf, an example, Beowulf. But then does it mean Wolverine, or is it a kenning, or is it just two things at the same time? It's something we see all over Germanic culture. So you have asked a very interesting question, and I have given a very long answer.
But I think
because the answer is not straightforward.
And I think sometimes we expect more straightforward representation from people in the past than we expect during our own time. Like, I think we accept this kind of vagueness of reference in our symbols sometimes and don't realize that people 2,000 years ago could be as vague.
Oh, yeah.
Driving around, I see a bumper sticker, or a little series of bumper stickers that has the dad and the mom, the 3 little kids, and the dog. It's like, okay, each sticker represents a particular person who exists. Okay, that's a direct representation. But when you see the bumper sticker that has the Tyrannosaurus eating the stick family members, I doubt that those stick family members represent specific people. They represent more the concept of somebody else's stick figure family, but not a particular one. Right? And I wonder if sometimes in these bracteates this is exactly that vague. Like, it's just supposed to be kind of the grandeur of a king, a grand personage, without necessarily being like, oh, this is so-and-so, son of so-and-so.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got copies of copies of copies of copies.
Precisely. And we can see the bracteate with the most clear inscriptions, the most famous one of the ones we've been speaking about today. It's very worn, and it's like it's worn on the side that would be the perfect spot for a finger, if you're a right-handed person, to touch over and over and over again. So it has been used for a long, long time at the point of the position.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. And a reminder that these things are being worn actively and shown and seen in a living culture.
So if it's been used for 120 years, the person who would be king at the start of this this time, if we are indeed to view it as an actual king, let's say would be Yaga. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that interpretation that we do have a king named Yaga, but anyways, if that was so, at the end of this period, after 100 years, of course, it's not going to be the same king. So why would you then write something about this particular king? Well, yeah, maybe you wouldn't expect it to be used 100 years or so, but yeah.
Yeah, hard to know. I mean, I guess you, in a present day context, you might have a medal awarded by Queen Elizabeth that's still worn by someone during King Charles's reign, something like
sure.
that.
Yeah,
but I don't know that that's a very good analogy for this, because it doesn't seem like, because we don't know the context in which these are given or presented, or who makes it for who. Yeah. I mean, just they're fascinating artifacts, though. And I think it's particularly fascinating when you look at something like that Fishman one, and you say it's important to someone to wear something like this, regardless of what it says or doesn't say.
Oh yes, it's the bling factor.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
well, not necessarily the bling in itself, but the connection to the people who are in power to commission something like this.
Yeah.
Because you would be in huge power to have the excess gold to produce something like this. You would, need a lot of it, and you would have contacts with the Romans.
And you think about someone, actually having that assemblage that's buried at Vindalev, right? I mean, how is that all coming together, right? That seems like an entire family's collection or something like that.
Yeah, the amount of gold is incredible, and I think a lot of people bought metal detectors when the horde was known or published. But when talking about metal detecting in Denmark, we have a really, really good cooperation between hobby metal detectorists and the local museums and archaeologists. I'm married to an archaeologist, and only this morning she said that, well, she has to be on Facebook because they have these metal detecting posts going on, and now we're currently in the season where they're getting new crops, sowing new crops, and before that they plow, and then that's a good time for metal detectorists to have a short search. So a lot of new interesting stuff is coming up at the moment. Will be more interesting stuff coming up during winter, and of course these people do not like the frost, because if there's frost you can't really search. Well, you could search, but you can't really dig the soil.
And that's legal in Norway and Denmark, but not in Sweden. Is that right?
Yes.
That's what I was
thinking. It doesn't work as efficiently in Norway. I think there are a couple of metal detectorist clubs who are good at having contacts with the archaeologists and have proper cooperations, but it just doesn't work the same way. It has to do with medieval laws in Denmark, because there's something called the Danefe, which means the riches of the crown or the Danes, but the one who owns everything with a certain amount of value that comes from the soil is the queen or the monarch. But when you give Danefe, which you find in the soil or somewhere in Denmark to the Queen. And nowadays it's just the National Museum. You get something in return, and today it's money. So the people who found the Vindelev hoard got rich.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, good for them.
Good for them. I mean, that's also one of those things that drives the metal detecting, and the whole contact with the museums is more lucrative than just stealing the thing and selling it on the black market.
Right. Well, I understand. Yeah, the trade-off there, that the crown or the museum is considering it worthwhile to pay people for these things, so they don't try to put it on the black market, so that the information stays public. Yeah, understood. That's cool. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about this today. I mean, it's really fascinating, and great to actually just look at these pictures with you and have you walk us through your interpretations and show us some really unexpected weird stuff. That fish man. That's
it's a very lovely little thing. I love it.
And is your article publicly accessible? Is it on your academia? You sent me a copy, but is there somewhere?
It's not currently open access, but it will be next year. So it's going to be under, you would have to be within an institution who pays the fee for it, or pay it yourself. But after a year, it will be open access.
Okay, cool. And we got a nice little preview of some of it right here. So thank you very much for that. All right, well, Krister, thank you so much again for your time. Thank you, Patreon, for your support and for coming out for this and for great questions. And for now, I wish everybody all the best.
Thank you.